Treason is not the reason for the season. Episode 9, Attacking the Iron Pipeline. The previous video explained that the proposed Militia Selective Service Act of 20XX would mandate universal background checks and registration for all guns and gun owners, and how that would honor the Founding Fathers' intentions for how they envisioned militias defending the state. This video explains why the people of the United States would want the Militia Selective Service Act of 20XX as described in the previous video. In short, MiSSA would locate and attack the iron pipeline, i.e. the primary source of guns for criminals. Now, the militia as terrorism extremists will say that places like Chicago have strict gun laws but also have high gun homicide rates, and therefore, the extremists argue, that proves gun control doesn't work. However, the vast majority of guns used in crimes in the US all come from states with little to no gun control laws. States with strict gun control laws, such as mandatory background checks and registration, generally find that about 2/3 to 3/4 of guns used in a crime in their states came from outside the state, usually from a state with weak gun control laws. The borders between states are completely porous, and it takes minimal effort for a criminal to drive from New York, where gun laws require background checks, to a state that allows them to buy a gun via a private sale that requires no background check and no paperwork, and drive back to New York. The issue isn't that strict gun control laws in places like Chicago don't work. The issue is criminals simply bypass strict gun control laws in Chicago, by driving to Indiana, buying a gun with cash, and driving back to Chicago. It's like when the drinking age was different from state to state. If a person wasn't old enough to drink in their state, they could simply drive across the border to get alcohol. The state with the lowest drinking age set the age limit for all the states around it. The solution to underage drinkers driving across state lines was to make the drinking age the same in all states. The National Minimum Drinking Age Act of 1984 required all states set the minimum drinking age to 21. The solution to the iron pipeline is similar: have a minimum law that applies to all states so that criminals can't just drive to another state to get guns easily. With the Militia Selective Service Act of 20XX, universal background checks and registration, at the federal level, would apply to all states, and would make it a lot harder for criminals to get most of their guns. Militia as terrorism extremists will whine that it's already illegal to sell a gun to a criminal, so mandating licensing and registration for all gun owners is collective punishment. But that's not how the iron pipeline actually works. It's against the law to sell a gun to a criminal, however, because there is no legal requirement for a paper trail for buying and selling a gun in a private sale. It is nearly impossible to convict someone of selling a gun to a criminal. Buying a gun specifically to turn around and sell it to a criminal is called a straw purchase. Straw purchases are illegal but extremely hard to convict. Here's why. Here's a little story of how easy it is for a criminal to get a gun. Casey is a criminal. Casey wants a gun. But Casey lives in a state like New York where mandatory background checks will prevent him from buying a gun anywhere in the state. So Casey gets in his car and drives to Texas, where background checks are not required for private sales. Sam is a straw buyer who lives in Texas. Casey gets in touch with Sam and tells him he wants a gun. Sam buys the gun from a store, which requires a background check, then Sam turns around and sells it to Casey for a nice cash bonus. Casey then drives back to New York. A year later, Casey is caught committing a crime with the gun in New York. He is arrested by Pete, the police officer. Pete traces the serial number of the gun to Texas, where the store shows a background check for Sam. Pete wants to charge Sam with straw buying the gun and selling it to Casey. To convict Sam of doing a straw purchase for Casey, Pete has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Sam sold the gun to Casey, and that Sam knew Casey was a criminal. Sam claims that he sold the gun to a little old lady outside a church in Dallas. He says she wanted to protect herself from burglars and he just wanted to help her. Sam gives a vague description and says she paid cash for the gun. In Texas, there are absolutely no legal requirements for any kind of paper trail for the purchase or sale of a gun in a private transaction, so the fact that Sam has no evidence to prove he sold it to a little old lady is not a crime. And Officer Pete is left trying to prove Sam sold the gun directly to Casey, beyond a reasonable doubt. Which means he has to prove the little old lady does not exist. Pete has to prove a negative, which is inherently difficult. And given that Casey got the gun a year ago, without a video recording or confession, proving he bought it from Sam is nearly impossible. Sam, the straw purchaser, walks free. And continues making money selling guns to criminals. Straw purchases are illegal, but the complete lack of any requirement for any kind of paper trail makes it impossible to convict most straw buyers. The above example was a best-case scenario, because Sam the straw purchaser bought the gun from a dealer, which created a federally mandated paper trail that linked the gun to Sam. In reality, straw buyer Sam would likely buy a gun in a private sale in a state that does not require any paperwork for private sales, and then turn around and sell it to Casey the criminal for a markup. Federal law requires the gun dealer do a background check on the buyer, Tom. Tom then sells the gun to Dick in a private sale, therefore no paperwork. Dick sells the gun to Harry in another private sale, so no paperwork, and then Sam buys the gun from Harry in another private sale. At which point, there is no paperwork to even indicate that Sam ever owned the gun. The last recorded transaction of who owns the gun was the gun dealer selling the gun legally to Tom. After that, it changed hands so many times, that no police officer would be able to track down the sequence of buyers to ever prove in a court of law that Sam ever owned the gun, let alone prove that Sam sold the gun to Casey the criminal. Every sale after the dealer is a private sale, and in most states these private sales require no paperwork, so there's no way to determine who the straw buyer is. However, with MiSSA, which requires all gun owners pass background checks and all guns be registered to their owners, the law creates a trail of breadcrumbs from store to law-abiding owners, to straw buyer. And suddenly convicting a straw buyer of gun trafficking is just a matter of showing the jury that the paper trail leads directly to the straw buyer, but the straw buyer has no paper trail showing they ever sold the gun. Someone sells the gun to Sam. Sam passed the background check. The gun registration is changed from the previous owner to Sam. Sam then sells the gun to Casey without doing a background check, without changing registration of the gun to Casey, and takes cash for the gun. A year later, Casey is caught committing a crime and the gun is still registered to Sam. The police arrest Sam for selling the gun to Casey without doing a background check or updating the registration. Sam says he sold the gun to a little old lady in front of a church who paid cash. The police say if this is true, why is there no paper trail of him doing a background check on a little old lady, and why is there no paperwork showing he transferred the registration of the gun to this little old lady? The police can prove to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that the gun was owned by Sam, that a year later the gun was used in a crime by Casey, and that Sam never filed any paperwork to show that he sold the gun to anyone. Sam is convicted of gun trafficking, which prohibits him from ever legally owning a gun. And Sam suddenly finds it much harder to make money doing straw purchases for criminals. MA20XX uses mandatory background checks and mandatory gun registration to have law-abiding gun owners create a paper trail of who owns what guns, and that paper trail allows the police to pinpoint exactly who the straw buyers are, and more importantly, have a paper trail that can prove beyond a reasonable doubt, prove in a court of law, that a straw buyer is trafficking guns to criminals. Registration isn't about punishing law-abiding citizens. It's about pinpointing the straw purchase people selling guns to criminals and convicting them. Militia as terrorism extremists will then argue that this can't stop criminals from getting guns because criminals don't do paperwork and will just break that law too. But the system doesn't rely on criminals doing the paperwork. It relies on law-abiding citizens doing the paperwork. In our previous example, the store that sold the gun to Sam did a background check on Sam and changed the registration of the gun to Sam. And because Sam is required to file a background check on whoever he sells the gun to and change the registration of the gun to that new owner, the fact that he didn't, but the gun ended up in the hands of a criminal, used in a crime, means that the police can prove that Sam didn't do the legally required paperwork, and convict Sam of gun trafficking. There's an obscure court case that comes into effect here. Haynes v. United States from 1969. It ruled that the government cannot require criminals who cannot legally own a firearm to register ownership of such a firearm to themselves, because it would violate the Constitution's Fifth Amendment rule against self-incrimination. The government can't require criminals register their guns because that instantly self-incriminates them for breaking the law. Therefore, to pinpoint who is doing the straw purchases and selling guns to criminals, the government would have to require all firearms be registered at the point of each legal transaction. The last registered owner would be the straw purchaser who passed a background check to buy a gun, and then sold the gun to a criminal without paperwork. If a gun is legally sold by a store to Tom, then Tom legally sells it to Dick, then Dick legally sells it to Harry, then Harry legally sells it to Sam, then Sam illegally sells it to Casey. The law can only require registration of the gun from the store, to Tom, to Dick, to Harry, to Sam. Sam passed the background check, so his purchase of the firearm is legal. And therefore Sam is required to register the gun to himself when he buys it. Sam then sells the gun to Casey without paperwork. This is expected. Criminals won't do paperwork. And also, the law can't require criminals do that paperwork because that would self-incriminate them, and is therefore unconstitutional. Sam's sale of the gun to Casey will have no paperwork because Sam is trying to hide the transfer, and because it would be self-incrimination. But as long as the registration for the gun is recorded at each legal exchange of hands, the paper trail leads directly to Sam the straw purchaser. And Sam has to register the gun to himself when he buys it because it was a legal purchase. He passed the background check to buy the gun, therefore, it's a legal purchase. When Harry sold the gun to Sam, both Harry and Sam update the registration of the gun to now be owned by Sam. When Sam sells the gun to criminal Casey, they won't do any paperwork. But when Casey is picked up committing a crime with the gun a year later, the police have rock-solid evidence that Sam owned the gun and never filed any paperwork for a legal transfer of sale. If Sam claims he sold it to a little old lady outside a church, then that would have been a legal purchase and would have required Sam to do paperwork for a background check and change of registration. Since he didn't, the police have enough evidence to convict Sam of selling a gun without doing the required paperwork. I.e., they can convict Sam of gun trafficking. Sam is convicted of gun trafficking, and can no longer purchase guns easily at retail prices and sell them at black market prices. He would have to pay black market prices to buy a gun, and sell it at black market prices, meaning, Sam is no longer an easy source of guns for criminals anymore. This trail of breadcrumbs leads the police to every straw purchaser for every gun ever picked up at a crime scene. And this eventually removes most straw buyers from the black market. 2/3 of all guns used in crimes become much more difficult for criminals to acquire. And as a result, gun crime goes down. All because of universal background checks and registration. The current situation is that federal law only requires background checks for guns sold by dealers. Which means, the gun is registered from the store to Tom. There is currently no federal requirement for background checks or registration for private gun sales. And then the gun gets lost when it transfers to Dick, then to Harry, then to Sam, and finally to Casey. When the gun is recovered at a crime scene, the paperwork only shows the gun dealer sold the gun to Tom. Even if the police interview Tom, and somehow find Dick, then interview Dick, and somehow find Harry, then interview Harry, and then get an artist rendition of Sam, and do a nationwide search for him, and somehow manage to find Sam, even then, Sam can claim he sold the gun to a little old lady in a private sale. And since he isn't required to file any paperwork, the police can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the little old lady is Sam's fabrication. The current federal gun control law that only requires background checks for guns sold by dealers is exactly what allows straw purchasers to easily buy guns at retail prices in private sales, then turn around and sell those guns at marked up black market prices to criminals. That law is exactly what allows straw purchasers to thrive and avoid ever getting convicted of selling guns to criminals. With mandatory registration of all gun sales, the police can prove Sam owned the gun, and can prove that Sam either sold it to a legal gun buyer and failed to update the paperwork, gun trafficking, or sold it to a known criminal, Casey, another form of gun trafficking. Some states require background checks and registration for private sales, but many states do not, providing cover for people like Sam for their black market gun trafficking. MiSSA doesn't need criminals to do the paperwork for the law to catch the criminals. And Haynes v. U.S. says the law can't make criminals do the paperwork anyway. The law works by having law-abiding citizens doing the paperwork, which creates a trail of breadcrumbs to the straw buyers, and that trail leads police directly to the straw buyers, with enough evidence to convict them of gun trafficking. Mandatory background checks and mandatory registration won't prevent every single gun tragedy. It won't stop every single criminal from getting a gun. It won't stop the law-abiding civilian from buying a gun and then going on a shooting spree. But roughly 2/3 of all guns used in crimes come from states that have no universal background check/registration for all gun sales. States with strict gun laws find that 2/3 of guns used in crimes came from out of state. MA20XX will make those guns a whole lot harder for criminals to get a hold of. Right now, 14,000 people are murdered by a gun in the US every year. Making 2/3 of guns a lot harder for criminals to get could save thousands of lives every year. And the great part is this: background checks of gun owners and mandatory registration of guns is totally an idea the Founding Fathers supported. They implemented it a bit differently, but the Militia Act of 1792 required able-bodied men to register for militia service, and own a specific set of weapons for potential militia service. Nowhere in any of the foundational documents of the United States is a right to anonymously hoard unregistered weapons. A state cannot manage, train, and call up a militia unless they are registered. So, universal background checks of all gun owners and mandatory registration of all guns would fall fully within what the Founding Fathers intended with regards to militias. The purpose of MA20XX is not to burden law-abiding gun owners with a lot of paperwork, high fees, and lots of red tape. The purpose is to use law-abiding gun owners as a way to help police find the straw purchasers who supply the iron pipeline. If law-abiding gun owners support MiSSA and do the paperwork and transfer registration of the guns they buy and sell, then any gun recovered in a crime will point to the last legal owner of that gun, and that person will have to do some serious explaining to the police. So, you want this law to be easy for law-abiding people to follow, because they are the ones doing the work to create the trail of breadcrumbs to the straw buyers. And you want those breadcrumbs. Make it easy for people to do the paperwork, make licensing something that can be done at any gun store, police station, or DMV or any similar government institution. Make the system rock solid, make it fast, and make it cheap, so that the fee to cover expenses is low, and some fixed amount. Once MiSSA is passed, keep in mind that there are already a lot of guns in the iron pipeline. Criminals have a lot of unregistered guns that they have access to. And people who don't want to deal with licensing and registration may just claim they don't own any weapons. Those weapons have the potential to feed the iron pipeline for years. The more people who license and register their guns, the more breadcrumbs there are pointing to the straw buyers. So make the system as easy as possible for law-abiding people to use to get those breadcrumbs. The more breadcrumbs, the more straw buyers you find and convict. The more straw buyers you find and convict, the more you cut off criminals from their easy access to guns. It might take a few years to pinpoint the current straw buyers and use up the existing pile of black market guns. Australia had a mass shooting in 1996, and in response they passed sweeping, nationwide gun reform. Within a few years, gun homicides had dropped 40%. But it did take a few years for the unregulated guns to flush out of the black market. Expect a similar lag between passing MiSSA and a large drop in homicides in the US. It will take a few years, and it will take as many law-abiding citizens as possible in support of MiSSA for it to work. But it will work. Going after the iron pipeline with mandatory universal background checks and registration will save thousands of lives every year. A little paperwork, completely in line with what the founders would have supported, will save thousands of lives. Treason is not the reason for the Second Amendment. Treason is not the reason for the season.